It started with the blinding glare of police lights and the cold, unyielding grip of handcuffs on his wrists, all because he'd stopped to rest his eyes. For Marcus, a man of impeccable character, being treated like a criminal was a deep and searing humiliation. The officers saw his skin color, not the respected attorney he was, and in their eyes, he was guilty without question. They sneered and mocked him, confident they were untouchable, just another routine arrest of a man they had already judged. They had no idea that their fate, their careers, and their freedom now rested in the hands of the very man they had just thrown in a cell. How could they know their world was about to be turned upside down? Marcus Vance was a man built from patience and precision. His life was a testament to the idea that the system, for all its flaws, could work. At 45, he had earned a quiet but formidable reputation in legal circles, not through fiery courtroom theatrics, but through meticulous preparation and an unshakable belief in the letter of the law. He was the kind of attorney who saw the Constitution not as an abstract document, but as a living blueprint for fairness. His office, filled with shelves of leather-bound books and framed letters of gratitude from clients, was a sanctuary of order. He'd spent 2 decades defending people from all walks of life, often taking on cases others deemed unwinnable, finding justice in the fine print where others saw only defeat. He believed in the inherent goodness of the system because he had dedicated his life to being one of its honorable stewards. He understood its imperfections better than most, but he chose to work from within, convinced that integrity was the only force capable of steering it right. This particular journey was a long one, a 700-mile stretch of asphalt connecting his parents' quiet retirement home to his own bustling life back in the city. He'd spent the weekend helping his father fix a leaky roof and listening to his mother's stories, a rare and cherished pause from his demanding career. Now, the drive back was a marathon against the clock and his own body's need for rest. As the sun bled away, the highway became a hypnotic river of red taillights and white lines, pulling him deeper into the night. His car, a modest but reliable sedan, hummed along, the gentle vibrations of familiar comfort. He was a husband and a father of 2, and the thought of his family waiting for him was the fuel that kept him going. He imagined his wife, Sarah, leaving the porch light on, and his children, asleep in their beds, unaware of their father's long pilgrimage home. It was this image that made him push on, even as his eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile marker. He had crossed the state line hours ago, entering a county he knew only by its reputation. Callaway County. It was a name that occasionally surfaced in legal briefs and whispered conversations among colleagues. On the surface, it was picturesque, a patchwork of rolling hills and small, tight-knit towns that seemed frozen in a simpler time. But beneath that veneer was a different story, one of an aggressive sheriff's department that prided itself on a zero-tolerance policy, which too often translated into harassment and overreach. Marcus had read about the traffic stops that escalated without cause, the questionable searches, and the disproportionate arrest rates that plagued the county. He wasn't scared, but he was aware. It was a professional curiosity, the same way a sailor notes a subtle shift in the wind. He felt a faint, almost imperceptible tension in the air, a sense of being an outsider in a place that kept a close watch on its own. He made sure to keep his speed exactly at the limit, his hands firmly at 10 and 2, a creature of habit and caution. He was just passing through, another anonymous traveler on a dark highway, and he wanted to keep it that way. The first yawn was a warning. The second was a demand. His focus began to soften at the edges, the crisp lines of the road blurring for a fraction of a second too long. He fought the urge, turning up the radio and cracking the window to let the cold night air shock him awake. But it was a losing battle. He knew the risks of drowsy driving, he'd seen the tragic outcomes in case files. The responsible part of his brain, the one that governed his life, took over. He saw a blue sign ahead, illuminated in the high beams of an oncoming truck, rest area, 1 mile. It was a beacon of common sense. The thought of a 30-minute nap, a brief surrender to his body's needs, felt like an incredible luxury. It wasn't a sign of weakness, it was the right thing to do. It was the choice a good father and a sensible man would make. Pulling into the rest stop, he felt a wave of relief. It was well lit, clean, and dotted with a few other cars and semi-trucks, their drivers also seeking a temporary refuge from the road. He found a parking spot away from the main building but directly under a tall, bright lamp, bathing his car in a pool of white light. He checked his doors, making sure they were locked, and sent a quick text to his wife, getting tired. Stopping for a quick nap. Love you. He knew she'd see it in the morning and be glad he'd been safe. He reclined his seat, the worn leather groaning softly, and closed his eyes. The engine was off, the silence broken only by the distant roar of trucks on the highway. He thought of the final leg of his journey, just a few hours left before he'd be home. He pictured the morning, the smell of coffee, the chaos of getting the kids ready for school, the simple, beautiful rhythm of his normal life. He was a man who lived by the rules, who respected the law, and who had just made the safest possible decision. As he drifted into a shallow sleep, the last thing he felt was a quiet sense of peace, completely unaware that he was about to be judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin, in a place where the law had a different, darker meaning. The peace of Marcus's sleep was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, violent intrusion of light. A flashlight beam, sharp and blinding, sliced through his driver's side window, followed by 3 hard raps against the glass. It wasn't a polite tap, it was a percussive, demanding knock that vibrated through the car. For a moment, he was lost in the disoriented fog between sleep and consciousness. He sat up, his heart thudding against his ribs, his mind struggling to catch up. He saw the unmistakable silhouette of a uniformed officer, a wide-brimmed hat blocking the glare of the overhead lamp. His first thought was of an emergency, a warning, a reason for this jarring wake-up call. He felt no fear, only a citizen's dutiful concern. He lowered the window a few inches, the cold night air rushing in, and prepared to offer whatever help he could. But the words that met him were not of concern, they were laced with immediate suspicion. The officer, a young man with a tense jaw and restless eyes, leaned down, his face a mask of authority. He didn't ask if Marcus was all right. He didn't inquire about his travels. His voice was a low growl, a weaponized question that assumed guilt from the very first syllable. He demanded to know what Marcus was doing there, whose car he was driving, and if he'd been drinking. Each question was an accusation, and Marcus realized instantly that this wasn't an offer of help. It was an interrogation. A second officer emerged from the shadows, completing the picture of intimidation. This one was older, heavier, with a thick mustache and eyes that held a weary, cynical glint. He moved with a slow, deliberate swagger that spoke of a man who enjoyed his power. This was Officer Miller, and he was clearly in charge. Marcus, drawing on years of professional training in de-escalation, kept his voice calm and even. He explained that he was a long-distance traveler, that fatigue had set in, and that he had pulled over to rest for his own safety and the safety of others on the road. He handed over his license and registration, his movements smooth and non-threatening. He was an open book, a man with nothing to hide. Officer Miller took the documents, his thumb smudging the plastic over Marcus's photo. He glanced at the name, Marcus Vance, and then at the address in a far-off, affluent part of the state. A flicker of something, disdain, perhaps, or disbelief, crossed his face. He ignored the documents in his hand and continued the verbal assault, his partner echoing his tone. They questioned his story, suggesting other, more sinister reasons for his presence at a desolate rest stop in the middle of the night. They asked about priors, about drugs, about 100 fictional scenarios they were scripting in their minds. Marcus felt the first stirrings of frustration. He was a man accustomed to being treated with respect, a man whose word carried weight. Here, he was being reduced to a stereotype, his identity erased and replaced with their own ugly projection. He could feel the trap being set, the invisible walls of their prejudice closing in around him. He knew his rights. He had defended them for others in countless courtrooms. So, with the same calm resolve he used before a judge, he stated that he had answered their questions and that they had no probable cause to detain him further or to search his vehicle. The words, meant to be a simple assertion of constitutional law, landed like a lit match in a pool of gasoline. To Officer Miller, this wasn't a citizen exercising his rights, it was a suspect challenging his authority. The thin veneer of procedure vanished, replaced by raw, undisguised hostility. Miller's voice dropped, becoming a menacing command. He ordered Marcus out of the car. There was no room for discussion. Marcus complied, knowing that any resistance, no matter how justified, would only escalate the situation. He stepped out onto the cold asphalt, the harsh lights of the rest stop making him feel exposed and vulnerable. The younger officer pushed him against the side of his own car, the car he'd meticulously maintained, the car he was driving home to his family. The pat-down was rough, invasive, a clear physical expression of their contempt. Marcus remained silent, his mind a steel trap, recording every illegal procedure, every sneering comment, every violation of protocol. While the younger officer kept him pinned, Miller began to search the car. He didn't just look, he rummaged, tossing aside papers from the glove compartment, pulling up floor mats, his movements careless and destructive. He was on a fishing expedition, determined to find something that would validate his baseless suspicions. And then, he found the briefcase on the passenger seat. The officer pulled the leather briefcase from the car and snapped it open on the hood. Inside, nestled among neatly organized files, was the truth of who Marcus was. His business cards, embossed with the name of a prestigious law firm, read Marcus Vance, attorney at law. Beneath them lay his Bar Association identification card, complete with a professional, smiling photograph. For any reasonable person, this would have been the end of it. The discovery should have brought a halt to the harassment, perhaps even a grudging apology for the gross misjudgment. The audience holds its breath, waiting for the relief, for the moment the officers realize their colossal mistake. But what happened next was the deepest cut of all. Officer Miller picked up the Bar Association ID, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage. He shined his flashlight on it, then looked back at Marcus, a slow, derisive smile spreading across his face. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He accused Marcus of carrying a fake ID, mocking him, suggesting he must be one of those jailhouse lawyers who learns a few big words and thinks he can fool the world. It was a profound and deliberate act of humiliation. They weren't just arresting a man, they were attempting to dismantle his entire existence, to invalidate his education, his career, and his very identity. In that moment, Marcus's frustration burned away, leaving behind something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous: resolve. Their excuse for the arrest was laughably thin. They claimed to find a suspicious residue in a Ziploc bag at the bottom of his briefcase, a bag that contained the last of some trail mix he'd been eating hours earlier. It was a complete fabrication, a flimsy hook on which to hang their prejudice, but it was all they needed. The click of the handcuffs as they locked around his wrists was a sound that would echo in his mind for years. The cold, serrated metal bit into his skin, a physical manifestation of the injustice he was enduring. He, Marcus Vance, a defender of the law, was now its captive. They pushed him into the back of the patrol car, the cage separating him from them a stark symbol of his new reality. The door slammed shut, and he watched through the smeared plexiglass as they continued to rifle through his car, their silhouettes moving under the indifferent glow of the rest stop lights. The ride to the Callaway County Sheriff's Department was a blur of silence and flashing lights. Marcus said nothing. He simply sat, his back straight, his mind already shifting from the emotional shock to the cold, hard calculus of the law. He was no longer just a victim of this injustice, he was becoming its chief prosecutor. The booking process was a systematic stripping away of his humanity. His fingerprints were taken, his face captured in a flat, soulless mugshot. He was ordered to remove his belt and shoelaces. His tailored suit, a symbol of his professional life, now felt like a costume. The officers processed him with a bored, mechanical efficiency, their faces impassive. He was just another body to be filed away. When he was granted his one phone call, he didn't call his frantic wife. He called David, a brilliant bulldog of a litigator from a neighboring county, a man he trusted implicitly. His voice was devoid of panic. It was the voice of a lawyer directing a colleague, providing the names of the officers, the location, and a concise summary of the myriad of rights violations. He was already building his case from inside the belly of the beast. He spent the next 6 hours in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair. The concrete bench was cold, the air thick with the quiet misery of the other detainees. He didn't sleep. He sat and let the reality of the situation wash over him, not with fear, but with a clarifying anger. He thought of all the clients he'd represented who had sat in cells just like this one, telling him stories of profiling and abuse that he'd believed, but had never truly understood on this visceral level. He had fought for them using the tools of the law. Now, he understood the profound weight of what it felt like to be on the other side, to be completely at the mercy of a broken part of the system he so deeply respected. Just before dawn, a guard unlocked his cell. The charges, thanks to David's furious series of phone calls, had been dropped due to a complete lack of evidence. A desk sergeant, a man with a sour expression, pushed his belongings across the counter in a large plastic bag without making eye contact. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake, just a dismissive grunt as he was shown the door. Marcus stepped out into the cold, gray morning. The world felt different, sharper, as if a filter had been removed. The system hadn't just bent, it had broken. It had been used as a weapon against him. But as he stood on the steps of the sheriff's department, watching the sun rise, he wasn't a broken man. The humiliation of the night had been forged into an unshakable purpose. This was no longer just a personal violation. It was a declaration of war. And they had no idea who they had just gone to war with. The air in the Callaway County courtroom was stale with the smell of old wood and cheap coffee. It was a small, unimpressive room, a place for minor infractions and procedural hearings, not for life-altering reckonings. But a reckoning was exactly what was on the docket. 24 days had passed since Marcus Vance's arrest, a period he had filled with a cold, methodical fury. He had filed a detailed, ironclad complaint against the 2 officers, forcing this preliminary departmental hearing. For Officer Daniel Miller and his younger partner, Thomas Reed, this was nothing more than an irritant. They sat at a long table beside a weary-looking county attorney, their uniforms pressed, their expressions a mixture of boredom and annoyance. In their world, complaints were a cost of doing business, a nuisance filed by disgruntled citizens that were inevitably smoothed over by the system that was designed to protect them. Miller whispered a joke to Reed, who cracked a faint smile. They had the swagger of men who had never faced real consequences. They remembered the arrest vaguely, just another mouthy suspect trying to act tough at a rest stop. They didn't even clearly recall the man's face, only the satisfaction of putting him in his place. They were confident, untouchable, and utterly blind to the judicial tsunami that was about to break over their heads. The bailiff, a portly man with a voice accustomed to commanding attention, stood. "All rise," he droned, his words echoing slightly in the quiet room. The small assembly shuffled to its feet with practiced habit. A side door near the judge's bench opened, and a figure emerged, draped in the stark black robes of the judiciary. The officers, along with everyone else, kept their eyes forward, their movements automatic. It was just another judge, another cog in the machine that would ensure this little problem went away. The robed figure walked with a steady, deliberate pace to the elevated bench and sat down, the old leather chair letting out a soft groan. For a moment, there was only the sound of papers being shuffled, the soft clink of a water glass. The judge adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and then lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the room. It was then that the first crack appeared in Officer Reed's composure. His eyes, which had been drifting towards the clock on the wall, snapped back to the bench. His brow furrowed in confusion. He saw a familiar pair of eyes, a familiar facial structure. He nudged his partner, Miller, who shot him an annoyed glare. But Reed was persistent, his subtle gesture now frantic. Miller, sighing with exasperation, finally looked up properly at the man on the bench. And the world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Miller's brain struggled to reconcile two impossible realities. The face he was looking at, calm, intelligent, and radiating an aura of absolute authority, was the same face he had seen in the back of his patrol car, illuminated by the harsh, flashing lights. It was the face of the man he had mocked, the man whose profession he had ridiculed, the man he had personally handcuffed and booked like a common criminal. The color drained from Miller's face, replaced by a sickly, pale sheen. His smug posture evaporated, his shoulders locking into a rigid, terrified stiffness. He felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine, a primal fear he usually inspired in others. The man from the rest stop wasn't just a lawyer. The man from the rest stop was a judge. And he was presiding over their hearing. The room had fallen into a tomb-like silence. Everyone could feel the sudden, massive shift in the atmosphere. The judge let the silent horror hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was not loud or angry. It was far worse. It was calm, measured, and dripping with the ice of pure, unimpeachable authority. He picked up the case file, his fingers steady. "We are here to address the internal complaint, case number 7-3-4B, he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the stunned courtroom. "A complaint filed by Marcus Vance regarding the conduct of Officer Daniel Miller and Officer Thomas Reed during a stop on the night of August 26. He set the papers down gently and looked directly at the two officers, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. He slowly took off his reading glasses, placing them deliberately on the polished wood of the bench. "Before we proceed," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal yet losing none of its power, "it is important that the record is clear." He paused, letting every eye in the room fixate on him. "I am Marcus Vance." A collective, sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. The county attorney's jaw literally dropped. The sheriff, who had been leaning back in his chair, shot forward as if he'd been tasered. But Marcus's eyes never left the two men at the table. Reed looked as though he might faint, his face ashen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Miller was frozen, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and panic. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare. This was the moment the ground gave way, the turning point where the hunter became the hunted, trapped in a cage of his own making. Marcus was no longer a victim seeking redress. He was the system itself, sitting in judgment over those who had so brazenly corrupted it. He picked up the complaint, a document he himself had authored with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't need to read it, he had lived it. But he read from it anyway, his voice a steady, relentless drumbeat of facts. He recounted the entire incident, not with the emotion of a victim, but with the dispassionate clarity of a judge reviewing evidence. He detailed the knock on his window, the immediate presumption of guilt, the illegal order to exit his vehicle. He laid out the sequence of the unconstitutional search, his calm assertion of his rights, and how that assertion was met not with compliance, but with aggression. When he got to the discovery of his briefcase, he paused. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The complaint alleges that upon discovering my bar association identification, you laughed and accused me of impersonating an attorney. Is it standard Callaway County procedure to dismiss professional credentials as fake when they contradict a personal bias?" The county attorney shot to his feet to object, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him with a single, sharp gesture. He wasn't asking for an answer. He was painting a picture for the record. He continued, describing the fabricated evidence of the trail mix, the humiliation of the handcuffs, the cold indifference of the booking process. With every word, he was dismantling their careers, brick by brick. The frustration he had felt in the back of that police car was now being mirrored on their faces. They were powerless, trapped in a perfectly legal, perfectly executed reversal of fortune. The audience could feel the immense, satisfying weight of justice finally swinging back, a pendulum of karma set in motion weeks ago, now reaching the apex of its arc. It was a triumph not of revenge, but of order restored, of power checked, of the system, however flawed, being forced to look at its own ugly reflection in the mirror he was holding up. After laying out the narrative of their gross misconduct, Marcus leaned back in his chair. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. In that silence, Miller and Reed were no longer officers of the law, they were just two men, stripped bare of their authority, their arrogance, and their impunity, left with nothing but the consequences of their actions. Marcus's gaze shifted from them to the sheriff and then to the county attorney. His look was a clear, unspoken message: this was not an isolated incident. This was a symptom of a disease, a culture of abuse that had been allowed to fester in the dark. He had been unlucky enough to be its victim, but he was now in the unique position to be its cure. He leaned forward one last time, his hands clasped on the bench. He was no longer recounting the past, he was delivering a verdict on their future. Based on the uncontested evidence presented in this complaint, he declared, his voice resonating with finality, this court finds sufficient cause to believe that multiple criminal statutes were violated. Therefore, I am referring this entire matter to the District Attorney's Office for immediate review and the pressing of criminal charges, including, but not limited to, official oppression, illegal search and seizure, and perjury. He then looked directly at the sheriff. I am also issuing a judicial recommendation for the immediate and unpaid suspension of both officers pending the outcome of that criminal investigation. He picked up the gavel. His eyes found Officer Miller's one last time, not with hatred, but with a profound, almost sorrowful gravity. He offered no parting lecture, no moralizing speech. The sentence was the speech. The consequences were the lesson. He lifted the small wooden mallet high. You judged me in the dark based on what you saw, he stated, his voice a quiet thunder that sealed their fate. Now, you will be judged in the light based on what you did. The gavel came down, its sharp crack echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot, the sound of an old world ending and a new one beginning. The sound of the gavel's crack hung in the air long after Marcus had left the bench. It was the sound of a world breaking, of an old order being irrevocably shattered. In the courtroom, a stunned, chaotic silence gave way to frantic whispers. The sheriff and the county attorney huddled together, their faces pale, their usual confidence replaced by a desperate urgency. They were no longer managing a simple complaint, they were at the epicenter of a political and legal earthquake, and the ground was still shaking. But the true story was in the vacant, terrified eyes of Daniel Miller and Thomas Reed. The two officers stood frozen, the bailiff's hand on their shoulders now feeling less like a colleague's touch and more like the first step in their own procession toward a jail cell. All the arrogance, all the casual cruelty they had wielded like a shield, had been stripped away, leaving them exposed and terrified. They were escorted from the courtroom not through the private entrance they had used before, but out through the main doors, past the shocked faces of their colleagues, their public humiliation now complete. They were no longer untouchable symbols of the law, they were just two men facing the ruin they had authored. As Marcus unrobed in the quiet solitude of his chambers, he felt no elation, no thrill of victory. There was only a profound and heavy sense of gravity, the feeling of a necessary, painful duty fulfilled. He had not sought revenge, he had sought balance. And the scales of justice, which had been so violently tipped that night at the rest stop, were finally beginning to right themselves. The fallout was swift and merciless. Marcus's judicial referral acted as a powerful accelerant, turning a slow-burning internal investigation into a full-blown criminal inferno. The district attorney, a man known for his political ambitions and his cozy relationship with law enforcement, found himself trapped in an inescapable spotlight. To ignore the referral from a sitting judge would be professional suicide. Reluctantly at first, and then with increasing vigor as the evidence mounted, his office launched a criminal probe. The case they built was airtight. David, Marcus's trusted colleague, had already secured the security footage from the rest stop, which showed a calm, compliant Marcus and two aggressive, overbearing officers. But the real nail in their coffin was their own body cam footage. The cameras, which they had likely forgotten were even recording, captured everything: their mocking tone, Miller's derisive laugh at Marcus's legal ID, and the complete absence of any probable cause for the search. Most damningly, It captured their conversation after placing Marcus in their car, where Miller was heard telling Reed how they would find something to make the arrest stick. It was a textbook case of official oppression and a prosecutor's dream. The trial of Miller and Reed became a statewide spectacle. The media descended on Callaway County, painting a picture of a corrupt department finally being held to account. The two officers, now stripped of their badges and their bravado, sat in court looking small and defeated. Their defense was flimsy, a desperate attempt to paint Marcus as an arrogant out-of-towner who had provoked them, but the video evidence was irrefutable. Marcus himself took the stand, not as a judge, but as a citizen, a victim. He recounted the events of that night with the same calm precision he had used in the hearing, his testimony a masterclass in credibility. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts: official oppression, perjury for the lies in their initial report, and conspiracy. The sentencing came a month later. Thomas Reed, the younger, more impressionable officer, received a sentence of 2 years, with a chance of parole for his cooperation. But the judge reserved his harshest penalty for the man who had orchestrated the abuse. Daniel Miller was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, a stunning and unprecedented outcome for a police officer in Callaway County. As he was led away in handcuffs, the same instruments he had once used with such casual disdain, his fate was sealed. The system he had so confidently manipulated had, in the end, consumed him whole. The consequences radiated outward, far beyond the two disgraced officers. The sheriff, facing a tidal wave of public outrage and a federal inquiry, announced his early retirement. The U.S. Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation into the Callaway County Sheriff's Department, uncovering a deep-rooted pattern of civil rights abuses and discriminatory policing. This led to a consent decree, a federally enforced mandate for sweeping reforms that would change the department from the ground up, forcing transparency, accountability, and a complete cultural overhaul. The department that had created Miller and Reed would itself be dismantled and rebuilt. For Marcus, life returned to a version of normal, but he was a changed man. When he sat on the bench now, he saw the people before him with a new depth of understanding. He had always been a fair judge, but now he was an empathetic one. He understood the tremor in a defendant's voice, the fear in their eyes when facing the monolithic power of the state, because he had felt it himself. His experience didn't make him anti-police, it made him pro-justice, holding law enforcement to the highest possible standard of integrity. His reputation grew, spreading through the legal community like wildfire. He became a legend, not for what he had done to Miller and Reed, but for what he represented, the idea that no one is above the law. His story became a symbol of hope and a case study in law schools across the country. It was a perfect, if painful, illustration of how the system is supposed to work when confronted with its own failings. Marcus, an intensely private man, found himself reluctantly thrust into the public eye. He accepted speaking invitations not to relish his own story, but to advocate for the principles he held dear. He spoke to young lawyers about the sacred duty of their profession, to community groups about the importance of knowing their rights, and to police academies about the immense responsibility that comes with a badge and a gun. He never spoke of revenge. He spoke of accountability. He spoke of the Constitution not as a dusty relic, but as a shield for the powerless. One evening, months after the trial had concluded, he sat on his back porch, watching his children play in the fading light. The sounds of their laughter were the sounds of the life he had been so desperate to return to that fateful night. His wife, Sarah, came and sat beside him, taking his hand. She had seen the toll the ordeal had taken on him, the quiet moments of reflection, the new weight he carried in his eyes. She understood that his fight hadn't just been for himself, it had been for the world he wanted his children to inherit, a world where justice was not a lottery, but a guarantee. The incident at the rest stop had been a crucible, a trial by fire that had forged him into something stronger, something more profound. It had reaffirmed his belief in the system, not because it was perfect, but because, when wielded with integrity and courage, it had the power to correct itself. Power doesn't create character, it reveals it. In the end, the two officers who had hidden behind their badges were revealed to be hollow men, defined only by their prejudice. And the man they tried to break, the man they saw as nothing more than a target, was revealed to be the very embodiment of the justice they had sworn to uphold. It proves that the ultimate authority rests not in a uniform or a title, but in the unwavering strength of one's own integrity.